Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
As we mentioned, she's a former high school government and law teacher who's now known by many as America's government teacher. She's got more than 1 million followers on Instagram. And just in the last few months, she's interviewed both Tim Walz as well as Vice President Kamala Harris.
The reality is that in this election, everything is at stake in terms of, one, having capable, competent leadership, but also what is at stake in terms of the risk on the other side of that split screen of having chaos and the potential destruction of our democracy.
That's Vice President Kamala Harris being interviewed by Sharon McMahon, who back on March 20th was before President Joe Biden dropped out of the race, about 4 months before.
She wasn't a candidate yet.
Look how much things have changed in such a short time. Sharon McMahon, also has a new book out. It's called The Small and the Mighty, 12 Unsung Americans Who Changed the Course of History.
Sharon joining us from Washington, D.C. Sharon, so great to have you here with us. And we want to talk about the book that you've got out. Looking forward to that. But we've got to ask you about talking to Kamala Harris, talking to Tim Walz, your experience, that conversation, and then kind of where we are here on this Friday, September 27th. Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, you're right. A lot really has changed, hasn't it? When I met with Kamala Harris, she was still stumping for Joe Biden. You could hear that she was talking about, how much is at stake in this election, but it was certainly well before she had decided that, her name was going to be on the ticket and before Joe Biden had decided he was going to leave. One of the things that I was struck by Kamala Harris, and I've met her a number of times actually, is that she absolutely knows how to be a very serious individual who takes issues very, very seriously. As you heard in the little clip that you played, she was speaking in a way that is quite authoritative. But she also has another side to her personality, which is on display, which is a more sort of fun-loving, joyful side to her personality. You see her smile and laugh quite a bit, which I think is something that a lot of, it's missing with a lot of politicians. You don't see a lot of members of Congress get on TV or give interviews where they're having fun. And that's something that I think sets the Harris-Walz campaign apart. Whether or not you want to vote for them, it's a difference of perspective and that they're trying to make politics fun.
Do you think that she, since she's become a candidate versus when she was vice president, she's less accessible to people like you? One of her criticisms, especially from the right, has been that she's not doing interviews.
Well, once she became a candidate, the amount of attention for her time, the vying for her time, was obviously very, very significant. And she has such an abbreviated schedule with which to win the presidency. I actually think it's an interesting case, which is something that I've said many times, is that we don't actually need a year and a half to choose who our president will be.
Agreed,
yes.
Right? This should be faster, but go ahead.
Yes, most of us can make a decision in a couple of months. We actually don't need 18 months of constant bombardment. It's exhausting. Most Americans find it quite exhausting. So I do think some of it is related to that. Obviously, I do not speak for her. I'm not affiliated with the campaign in any way. But I do think that some of it is just like trying to build the plane while flying it and trying to do all of the rallies. It doesn't leave a lot of time to do as many sit-down interviews. Of course, she's done some since then. But I do think there's just this element of like, how do I build an entire ground game in the next 1 week? You know what I mean? Like, there's an element of we got to move quickly here. Yes.
Well, how do we change the system? Is it a little bit of a broken one, considering what happened, with the Capitol following, Donald Trump not accepting the outcome and the uprising? I mean, do you feel like our system is broken in terms of the Electoral College? Like, how are you thinking about it bigger and broadly? Here we are, a nation that what are we, over a quarter of us, more than 250 years old and counting. And is it time to kind of do a little bit of a reboot? But how do we get there when the people in government are the ones kind of making these decisions and maybe kind of like the way it works? Maybe it works in their favor.
Yeah, it does work in their favor. I think that's true. And I do think that it is time to reform the electoral system in a number of ways. I don't think the system, first of all, works the way that the founders or the framers intended it to work. But I also think that the framers were very clear that the system should be refined as needed, which is why they built two separate ways to amend the Constitution right there into the document, right? This is not Holy Scripture. This is hey, here's a working document with some of our ideas of how we might run this country. And if it's not working out, here's two ways we can change it. So the concept of winner take all in the Electoral College, that's not in the Constitution. Winner take all actually didn't develop until 30 to 40 years after the Constitution was ratified. The framers never intended for a winner take all Electoral College. And most Americans do not feel well represented by the way the current system works. If you are a blue voter in Alabama or a red voter in California, I guarantee that there's an element of feeling disenfranchised by the way the system works. But I would also advocate for a couple of other changes. One of them is, as you mentioned, an abbreviated election period. We don't need to spend $1 billion each. That's what Biden and Trump each spent in 2020, $1 billion each. Most Americans agree we could find better things to spend $2 billion on than flyers that are put in the trash and commercials that air for 30 seconds at a time. That's one way. I also think so many Americans feel like the way the process for choosing nominees is broken. The process for how do we get to pick which person is going to represent us, the primary process, because they happen in a, sort of like dominoes fall. If you're in a state with an early primary, you get an outsized amount of input. State with a late primary, often there's only one person left standing. Why can't all Americans have a say on one national primary election day?
I agree. It's interesting. I'd heard on a podcast that I listened to and said that one thing to keep in mind, though, when you look at the election outcome when Donald Trump was elected, and I'm not taking sides here, but just understanding, we know this upcoming race probably expected to be a very close one. So you need to understand that when you have candidates, whether it was Joe Biden and Donald Trump or Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, who are very, very different individuals, that depending on who wins or loses, in the case of when Donald Trump was in the White House, that there is roughly half of America who agree with or like who he is as a leader. And you could say for the other side. And when you have such a difference, how do we make it so a government that is much more representative of people who feel very different about the way forward, not just as leaders, but as Americans?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is the problem that we're having now, which is that there is not an ideological center of the country. We have these sort of, farther left and farther right. And yes, you can make a lot of arguments that what's far left in America is not far left overseas. I understand all of that. But an ideological center is a moderating force in politics. It's a moderating force on the Supreme Court. It's a moderating force in Congress. You have to convince the people in the ideological center that the position that's slightly to the right or slightly to the left is the one worth taking. And that ideological center is often persuadable by the best arguments, by the best ideas. And so right now, the electoral system heavily favors people who are more ideologically extreme, more ideological, farther to the right or to the left. And that ideological center is something that we've eliminated by and large by gerrymandering and, by other mechanisms that, again, were never intended by the framers to be used. And that ideological center is something that Americans can choose to vote for if they want to. They can choose to vote for those candidates who are less extreme.
So you're optimistic about that, because it does seem like in recent years we've just become more polarized and we've become more extreme.
Well, we can't make positive change by having a fatalistic viewpoint that nothing good can ever happen. If you want positive change to happen, you have to have hope that it will. And I like to reiterate that hope is not a feeling that you wait to experience where you're just going to wake up one morning and the birds are going to be chirping and the sky's going to be blue. Our ancestors, the people who built this country, operated on this assumption that hope was a choice that they could make. And it was that choice from which all good things would follow.
Well, I think about immigrants, right? Or my, ancestors made a choice
to leave the country that they were in.
Right.
Come to the U.S. for ostensibly a better life.
Right. And not so easy initially, right? But they made that choice because they thought, longer term.
Let's get right back to Sharon McMahon. She's got a new book out. It's called The Small and the Mighty, 12 Unsung Americans Who Changed the Course of History. She's a former high school government and law teacher. She's got more than 1 million followers on Instagram. She's interviewed many individuals, Carol, including Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz.
She's definitely all in on government and politics. We can tell it's really fun. It's one of our, obviously, in an election year, it's been an interesting election year. It's been fun to cover and talk about. Sharon, who are these unsung heroes? And I don't know, how did you kind of go about this process? Why did you want to write it? Give us a little bit of background.
As you mentioned, I've been a teacher for a long time, and it is often the stories of the people you've never heard of that are some of the most interesting. They're the stories that children and adults alike feel like, dang, I wish I had known about them before, So those kinds of stories, the stories that you just don't see in the bold face in the textbooks, that are often the most intriguing. Americans love like a secret of some kind, the secret story behind something that happened, right? That's just sort of innate human nature. So I have found them interesting for a long time. And when I conceptualized this book and wanted to sort of bring some of these stories to bear, bring some of these characters to the table, that was one of the things I was thinking about is who has made a significant contribution, a significant impact where they were with the resources available to them. I think we often mistakenly believe that the levers of power that are accessed by government are the only ways to make a difference. And the people in this book, by and large, do not access power via the levers of government. They, most of the time, are not wealthy or famous. Most of them had very significant challenges in their own lives, and yet they set out by virtue of circumstance and luck in many cases, did something truly extraordinary with their lives. The examples in your book end in the 1950s, and I'm wondering if there are any examples today of people who are alive that wielded power outside of traditional government channels that we can look to who are currently alive. Mm-hmm. Well, there's many of them, of course. Whether I would put them in a book is another story.
Good point.
But of course, like Elon Musk is a great example of somebody who, who doesn't belong in my book, of course, but he's a great example of somebody who is using a tremendous amount of power outside of the levers of government. But most of the people in this book had no such large platform from which to jump like Elon does, did not have billions of dollars, did not have the ability to buy a mouthpiece the size of Twitter/X. But there are absolutely still great Americans. I think we often think of great Americans as being like the people in the black and white pictures or the oil paintings of the past. And I really wanted to dispel that notion that great Americans were people of the past. They're people today.
And I think many would argue that some of the poll workers, right, of the last few years in elections are those unsung Americans and heroes. Give us one or two, if you will, that are in your book.
One of the people that I really love in this book is a woman named Septima Clark, who had a very tumultuous upbringing. She almost commits suicide, is saved the last moment from committing suicide. On more than one occasion, she's like falsely arrested, fired, had just terrible circumstances happen to her. And she's eventually let go from her job as a teacher. And it is being let go from her job that allows her the time to start teaching adults. And one of the people that she begins to teach is a woman named Rosa Parks. And it is Septima Clark who begins something called Citizenship School that helps train African Americans all over the South to become voters, to become elected officials, to figure out how to make things happen for their own communities. And she said something that I think is really worth remembering today, which is that at the end of her life, someone asked her, what have you learned? And she says, I have learned that I can work with my enemies because you never know when they might have a change of heart at any moment. And what a sentiment that I feel like we really need today, because in an era where we just delete and block people we don't like, Septima Clark was out there working with her enemies because she knew they could have a change of heart at any moment.
Hey, I'm wondering, Sharon, about whether or not you're concerned that stories such as these get buried in the fights about U.S. history that are happening across the country, the book bans, the changing of curriculums.
You know, I don't think that my book is going to be banned necessarily, but I absolutely...
Not your book necessarily, but where their stories appear outside of your book,
Yes.
where,
Yes.
students not learning about these people.
I absolutely do. I absolutely share the very real concern about the sanitizing of history, because history is full of amazing things, but it's also full of many, many difficult things with which we must grapple. And that exercise of grappling with our history is an important one. It's an important one for our own intellectual development, and it's an important one for our own reckoning with our country. How can we be better if we don't know where we've come from?
Hey, one of the things, and I'm going to give this props to one of our producers, Cece, who's sharing. Are you a Gen Z? Yeah,
She's more or less. She's
okay. More or less.
Millennial, I guess.
She's young, though, or younger. In terms of how do we get, what are your thoughts about getting Gen Z to vote, getting them to the voting booth, actually, participate in this election? Is it about education? What is it?
Yeah, I think Gen Z is actually really motivated to vote. More than millennials were motivated to vote when they came of age, certainly more than Gen X or boomers when they came of age. I think Gen Z is uniquely motivated to vote this election season. And I think they are one of the demographics that is very significantly undercounted when it comes to polling results. Mm-hmm. Do you know any Gen Zers that answer the telephone? No, they don't answer the phone. So their ability to poll Gen Z is very, very limited. So in terms of how to motivate them to show up, I think we're doing it. I think understanding the gravity of an election like this is important.
You use social media, just got 30 seconds. I don't know. It feels like it can be so heated, certainly when it comes to politics. Just quickly, 25 seconds, your thoughts on social media and the use of it.
It's a tool. It's a tool that can be used for incredible harm and a tool that can be used for incredible good. I've raised over $10 million to give away on social media and registered thousands of people to vote.
Yeah.
It's a tool that you need to know how to wield.
All right. Well, we had fun with you. Sharon McMahon, The Small and the Mighty is her new book. Check it out. Love talking politics.
She's on a book tour. My sister going to see her on Thursday in Denver, actually. She just texted me.
I love that.
Very cool. This is Bloomberg.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.